He gave the appearance of things being so easy, but he always strove to be the best he could be at whatever he undertook. Unfortunately, his perfectionism meant that when we tried to get Paul to record some of the songs we loved, he refused because he knew he couldn't sing or play to the standard he once maintained. We did do some recordings with Stephen, as he was so proud of Stephen's fiddle playing and the fun we had all had singing with Stephen at various folk open mic and Americana clubs, as well as how that had been the trigger for Paul to take up the fiddle himself. Later, when he'd been receiving cancer treatment, he took a lot of persuading, even to sing or play in informal sing-arounds. Luckily, we did get to record one song when he agreed to sing for a sing-around. He was annoyed with himself for not remembering the beginning of the song and apologised that his voice had been affected by the chemo he was having at the time. As others who have been through chemo will attest, it has some horrible side effects, including peripheral neuropathy, which in the simplest terms can be described as loss of feeling in hands and feet. In the past I've said that he was entirely self-taught, but then I realised that that simply was not true. What Paul actually did was to find the best people to learn from. His enthusiasm and love for learning, coupled with his innate talents, were welcomed by the people he learned from, and he was always grateful for the skills they passed on, and was keen to do the same whenever and wherever he could. I'll try to give you a vaguely chronological account of his life with the help of the people who are here, who wish to tell you about how they knew Paul, and with accounts from those who have sent to me about Paul. I will mention, however, that as our late Queen remarked, recollections may vary. And that we won't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Paul's story is inextricably linked with others. I wish I could talk of so many who meant so much to Paul, some still with us, thankfully, like Jeff Barrett, Graham Lloyd, Pip O'Brien, and some who died before, like Maurice Gunn, Russell Peel, Jack Ewart, Cecilia Thorpe, but I must limit it to a not entirely representative few. So first of all, let me tell you about David Odding. Oh, right. Paul has written some of the marvellous memories and stories of his life up to the early 1970s, but they are episodic and there are many gaps. I hope that today we can fill in a few of them. Certainly there is one person who was a great friend and inspiration throughout his life who didn't get mentioned in the book, and I know that Paul wants us to mention him now. David Oddie was a few years older than Paul, but he seemed to recognise a kindred spirit and was a huge influence on Paul. They both had a strong nose to understand how things worked. They saw the beauty of well-made things and were fascinated with the mechanisms that others barely noticed and took for granted. Indeed, they had many similarities. They could both be outraged by the slipshod work they sometimes had to witness and have varying ways to deal with it. Mostly, if they thought the work was poor, they might remain very quiet. Although they were always happy to give advice if it was wanted, but they could be quite angry when self-appointed experts exploited other people's ignorance, of which perhaps more later. David was a gifted musical instrument maker, and Paul always wished he could have afforded to buy one of the guitars he'd made, or later there was a beautiful violin that Paul coveted. Whilst Paul never did get one of these superb instruments, David very kindly repaired several violins for Paul and Stephen, and took on a viola I'd seen in a charity shop that was in a very sorry state. He told me to get it and he'd fix it, and a wonderful job he made of it too. They didn't like a lot of fuss either. David, at his 80th birthday party, which his family had arranged, seemed to be smiling, and I said as much to him. I'm not smiling, I'm grimacing. But his kindness and his lifelong friendship meant a great deal to Paul. David knew Paul from his very beginning, and Paul knew David right up to his last few days on earth. Indeed, Paul visited David when he was in hospital. David had had a fall and broken his pelvis, and it was then discovered that he had very advanced bone cancer. He told Paul of an experience he'd had the day before. He had felt himself falling and the room whirling around, and he said, I thought, oh, I'm dying. Thank Christ for that. Paul was very taken with this and had, broadly similar outlook himself. Oh, Stephen, where's Stephen? Yes. I was going to get used to doing these bits, wasn't I? Sorry about this. There you go. So it's in this tone, isn't it?
We haven't had a dress
You need to
rehearsal.
put the,
We haven't had a dress rehearsal. So this is a recollection of Dad from Graham Wood. Graham Wood only lived 2 doors away from Paul when they were growing up, and he wrote to say that it was Paul who introduced him to guns when they were in their teens. Graham remarked that his parents didn't want him to have a gun, so he hid his in a hedge behind their house. Paul's interest in guns was very much to do with the intricacy of the mechanisms, and he was fascinated with how these had developed over the years. He also enjoyed being a really good shot, and even after his accident, he could still excel at target shooting and clay pigeon shooting. He was not so keen on the purpose of guns, though, as he hated even the idea of killing things. Mind you, Paul did remember how, as boys, they would run around in the woods armed with their air rifles, and that this was something they did quite a lot, until one lad actually got hit with a pellet in his forehead. I think that may have put an end to that part of their play, but they were so lucky to have these wild places to play and to learn about the trees, the plants, birds and animals that lived there. Paul had a particular love for butterflies, and recalled the vast numbers of these beautiful creatures there used to be, and was saddened to see numbers reducing year by year. Now I'd like to read a recollection from Desmond Chudley to do with coincidences. Desmond Chudley said that he knew Paul through a mutual friend, Dave Langdon, the man who first taught Paul to play the guitar. Years later, when they met up again, through another mutual friend, Paul Morris, he learned that Dave had actually given Paul his old Gibson Kalamazoo guitar in remembrance of those carefree days, a model that Des had made a copy of when he was making guitars. Des recalls seeing Paul when he was in a skiffle group that played for a dance at Shillingford Village Hall, and also remembers him accompanying Doris Woodley singing "Nobody Loves a Fairy When She's 40. He encountered Paul again when Paul had the gun shop, but then lost touch until Paul Morris brought them together for a musical evening many years later, and Des remarked that Paul playing violin accompanied me playing accordion, and that Paul had this ability to anticipate the tune I was playing and make it as if we'd been playing together for ages, especially on Scottish tunes. These sessions will be sadly missed. It was at these get-togethers that they discovered that they were both engineers, though in different areas of interest.
Paul has written quite a bit about his time in the RAF and his introduction to the folk scene in A Life and a Half. So before we ask Bill Crawford for his recollections, are you ready? It's like he's in the traps, ready to go. But first a snippet from Claire Penny, resulting from conversations she and Paul had. Ken, in his memoir, put the move to the Jolly Porter as 1964. That would tie in with my memories. I went to college in 1962 and only went to the left bank a couple of times before going off on hospital practice all over the country for a year. By the time I got back, it had either moved or was about to. He doesn't mention the twinning trip. Now, this was something that Paul told me about, the twinning trip to France. I don't think the folkies ever got invited again. He said he doesn't mention it in his book, but I remember him telling me about it. Something about singing Old de Gaulle was a very old soul in the street at night, very drunk, getting arrested, spending the night in the police station, but being released in the morning by gendarmes who confided that they hated de Gaulle. Frankie Armstrong would have liked to be here, but as she's currently in Australia, she sent this for us to read instead on her behalf. Somehow it feels fitting that the place Paul and I first met was also the place we met for the last time. Unsurprisingly, this was at the Stigma Folk Festival, with nearly 60 years intervening. It was an auspicious first meeting as he invited me to come and guest at the Exmouth Folk Club. And though I'd done a lot of floor spots and duetting with Lou Killen at clubs, this was my first paid professional solo gig. For a number of years, Paul played quite a part in my social and singing life. I was sharing a flat in North London with two other visually impaired friends. Paul moved to London and he was in and out of our lives very frequently. Paul had a gentle but very present energy, with a warmth and sense of humour and fun. I guess you could say we were part of the frequent inhabitants of the London folk scene, both as performers and punters. I look back very fondly on those exciting times and feel grateful for all the friendship and camaraderie I experienced through friends such as Paul. We've met up again on my 3 or 4 visits to the Sidmouth Fest since Paul left London, but I'm very glad we met up again at Sidmouth 2022. Over the year before we were back in the Fest in 23, we had a number of phone chats and he had sent me chapters of his memoir as he completed them. They brought back so many memories. On meeting him last year, I found his openness and totally unself-pitying acceptance of his imminent death really inspiring and humbling. His laugh was still infectious, and like so many who knew him over the years, I'm grateful for having known Paul. And now Bill, please.
Thank you. I was in the Jolly Porter for the opening night of the Exeter Folk Club, having discovered folk music in the Left Bank Coffee Bar in Paris Street. I can't remember when I first saw Paul there, but I remember him singing and accompanying himself on guitar. What sticks in my mind was that although he had a good traditional repertoire, such as The Wayward Boy, which at that time could have been autobiographical, he sang some of Kipling's Barrack Room Ballads, set to music by Martin Windsor, excuse me, long before the late Peter Bellamy was on the scene. His rendition of songs like Danny Deaver and Cells were just superb, and at that time, totally unique to Paul. I'm not sure how Paul knew Martin Windsor and Red Sullivan, who would appear as a duo at the JP from time to time, but I do remember that Paul would often visit them in London. More of that later. I have vague memories of looking after a load of files and row. What they contained, I dread to think, because I later found out that Martin was a bit of a wheeler-dealer underworld character in London, but a brilliant singer. After I left school, I worked for Devon County Council in their materials testing laboratory. This involved me travelling all over the county, sampling and testing construction materials such as concrete and asphalt. To make life easier, rather than working out of the back of a minivan, which I used to have to do, the council bought a mobile laboratory, basically a lorry fitted out as a lab. It was an HGV and it required a suitably qualified driver. I was a bit gobsmacked when the driver turned up for his first day's work. It was Paul. His interview had been conducted over a chessboard. Paul was shown into the materials engineer's office and noticed a chessboard all set up on the side. He asked John Pitchford, the engineer, if he played chess, and they subsequently had a game. I'm not sure if I ever knew who won it, but the story is true because Paul told me. I subsequently discovered from Jane that Paul was beaten fair and square. That was the start of a period of spending days with Paul in remote Devon quarries. Paul would drive us there at the crack of dawn, sometimes before dawn, and back while I tested the tarmac or whatever was being produced. He would always muck in and help, I think to avoid the boredom of just sitting there until it was time to drive home again. These days often involved very early starts, and it was during these days that I learned that he used to run a gun shop in Exeter. At this time, Paul had a car with a front bench seat, and being a bit of a DIY man, as we've heard already, I remember he adapted this seat so it would recline back right down to mesh in with the back seat, thus providing something akin to a double bed. He never quite perfected it, the mechanism to fold it down. So as a temporary measure, the front seat was held up by a pickaxe handle, which he would definitely knock aside if the need arose. I'm told this setup came in very useful when he was touring France sometime after, because he didn't need to find accommodation. I also remember one occasion when my line manager, Jimmy Sticks Maunder, he was a drummer and a bit of a wheeler dealer. He was going up to London for some reason, and Paul offered to keep him company on the trip. It was an excuse to visit the aforementioned Martin Windsor. Off they went, and all went well until the day after they returned. Paul had planted a packet of condoms in the glove compartment of the car, and it was discovered by Jimmy's wife, who didn't believe his version of events. Their relationship became a bit strained for a while. That's both Jim and his wife, and Jim and Paul. It was his DIY attitude which led to the accident in which he lost the sight of one eye, but he soon bounced back. I don't remember if Paul was still in the lab when I left and moved away in 1969, but I next caught up with him after I returned to the West Country. That was in 1990, although it was many years later at Pennymore when we met up again. By this time he was also playing the violin, and I seldom saw him play the guitar again. In those early days at the Porter, Paul was one of two blokes no one thought would ever settle down. The other was John Spree, who a lot of you will know. When at different times they both announced their intention to get married, there were cries of, "It won't last." But they both proved us wrong. They both married a Jane and settled down and produced offspring. I shall never forget Paul. He taught me a lot as a teenager, both in performance and life. One of his bits of advice I ignored. He told me I'd never get on anywhere in this world until I lost my West Country accent. But anyway, that's water under the bridge. Well done, Jane, for looking after him since your marriage, and especially during his illness. I know what that's like.
Got to impersonate a friend of mine who can't be here because her husband got rushed into hospital the other day and still in ICU. So I am not Jane, I am Gwyneth. I've been asked to contribute to this shindig because I am responsible for Jane and Paul meeting. In other words, it's all my fault. Now, Jane was a carefree pupil. Well, no, she wasn't actually carefree, but she attended the same school as me in Ilfracombe. We were in different classes, but we both belonged to the drama club, which met after school one day a week, back in those halcyon days when Devon County Council would actually pay the drama teachers to run dangerous activities such as this, that could lead to youngsters exercising their imaginations. They've obviously seen the light since. On one auspicious occasion, there was actually an opportunity to spend a whole weekend at drama-type activities at that well-known centre of hedonism, Crediton. There was actually a brilliantly set-up drama studio and a small but perfectly formed art centre, and it's still there, and that is where we spent the Saturday and Sunday. We were put up at the Ship Hotel, not just Jane and me, you understand, but a motley collection of similar type show-offs from schools across Devon. So Jane and I shared a room. There were several missing from the hotel that night, as one guy had just passed his driving test and had his own car. He and a few others had decided to go for a drive after dinner. They disappeared. That's a whole different story. Meanwhile, Jane and I found ourselves on our own, and for some reason it escapes me now, I began to sing songs. I knew the whole of Joan Byers' first UK LP off by heart, so Jane was in for a treat. Incredibly, she actually liked it, and I uttered the line that has now gone down in snow history. If you want to hear more, come along to Barnstaple Folk Club at the Golden Fleece on a Monday night. I don't know how long it took before Jane actually did this, but the timing was perfect because the very first club night she was there, so was Paul. Jane will tell you his chat-up line, if you give her enough to drink. There is never enough to drink. Amazing. So, if it hadn't been for me, they would never have met. I must add that Jane tells me the Ship Hotel is not where she heard me sing at all, it was at school. Just goes to show that memories are sometimes not what actually happened. I like my version best. Thank you one and all. Thank you, Paul, for being a brilliant friend over many years. Miss you loads. Oh, it's more of me, I'm afraid. Me and him. I first met Paul in 1966 at Barnstaple Folk Club, when my friend Gwyneth introduced him to me as our resident dirty old man. We went out for several years, although he was often travelling around the country doing gigs here, there and everywhere. His agent, Sandy Glennon, appeared to be as geographically illiterate as me, so he could book Paul at a club in Stoke-on-Trent one night, the next day in Portsmouth, and then up to Manchester. No wonder he got fed up with all the travelling. We kept in contact with letters and postcards. How quaint that must seem in this era of instant communication, although any new means of contact was something which Paul took to with alacrity. He loved his mobile phone, email, WhatsApp, and how that enabled him to keep in contact with so many friends. There were several folk clubs in North Devon, the main and earliest one being the Golden Fleece, run for most of its lifetime by Molly O'Brien and Mike Hilton, who both took me under their wing. Paul, being involved with the English Folk Dance and Song Society, came up to the various clubs and would do guest spots to help them out whilst local singers and musicians got more confident. In those days, lots of people were in the audience with no thought of being performers, though everyone loved to join in choruses, so it was important to have a nucleus of performers who were good enough for people to want to come along regularly. So Paul came up to North Devon quite often and would stay with Molly and Mike, even if he'd been guesting at another club in the area. We'd always try to meet up when he was staying there. One memorable date was when he picked me up from Ilfracombe and then drove us for miles, through Braunton, through Barnstaple, on the road towards Exeter. Where was he taking me? Eventually he turned into a field near Umberley. And I knew someone with a dark laugh. It was a steam fair. There were traction engines, steam lorries, steam rollers, but what really interested him was what was in the marquee, which exhibited a range of model engines. This was a revelation to me. I'd only previously been aware of his interest in folk music and our shared sense of humour. Another time, just after the film Bonnie and Clyde had been released, we went to Braunton Burrows and took turns shooting an air gun at empty cigarette packets. That's something I might confuse. Right. Sorry about this. Amateurs, you see. Molly and Mike were most hospitable people, and their Braunton home was always full of people from far and wide. They had a young French lad came to stay with them for a time, and he and Paul became great friends. Although Danielle had died in 2005, Paul had kept in touch with his brother Pierre, who wrote, "Paul was my brother's best English friend. He was like an older brother to us when we were teenagers. My mother and my sister also met him." This is fantastic English for we couldn't write in the French like they can write in English. "My mother and my sister also met him when he came down to Marseille and kept such a good souvenir of him, I know. Paul will forever remain engraved in my memory. I remember he once came to Exeter Station to meet us when we were on our way to Barnstaple and brought us to his mother's home for a cup of tea. I remember him singing at Barnstaple's Folk Club and also in the cafes here in Cassis, and good times we spent with my brother. You will see that Paul talks of his trip to the south of France in A Life and a Half. Although we went out for about 2.5 years, he was often away, working in London, singing all around the country, driving Alex Campbell to gigs for a time, and eventually we parted company, so I don't know much about Paul's life during the 1970s. Someone who knew him earlier, but also during the time when Paul had his dreadful accident, is Robin Gray, who will tell you a little about those times for us now.
Chairs over there in the corner as well.
I've got my glasses on, I still can't see.
You coming to sit down?
No, I want to know where Jim was.
Jim is here.
Oh.
Well, here we are. After several years, is that switched on? Oh, it is now. You can now hear me. What's a treat. Now, after several years, a bit like Paul, playing skiffle, I met with a friend, Dave Watts, and together we became interested in the newly emerging folk revival scene. We got together, you remember that, we got together and we started a folk club which became very successful. Folk Song at the Railway, Catford Bridge. We had all the singers, you've heard lots of them mentioned tonight, but one group that we really enjoyed was the Journeymen from Exeter, and the Journeymen would really enthrall our club. And they said to us, why don't you get, we know a very fine singer, you all know who it was, you'll love him. And it was Paul Snow, of course. Paul Snow turned up and he immediately made tremendous friends with Dave and myself. We had similar interests. We both liked folk music. We loved talking to the people, telling them stories. We had interests in antiques and historical things, insects and other things which we won't mention. Yes, Paul and I became extremely good friends. He played with us a lot of times. This is a picture, get it the right way up, of Paul, which I'll leave here. This is Paul actually at the folk song at the railway with Dave Watts there and Scots John Pottinger. We were the Taverners, you may have heard of them. And there he is, entertaining. And he used to come with us to Climping, where we did the Climping Dragon, which we also took to Sidmouth. You may have seen it there. A horrible thing that we invented. Based on Sidmouth, we had this huge dragon that I used to get inside with a big pointed head. We had people dressed as St. George and a fox and various things. Lots of beautiful musicians playing music, and then at the end, after all the audience had danced around the dragon, we cut off its head. Don't think Paul liked that bit much. But then the dragon would run off to the sea. Now, after that, we sort of kept in touch, mostly phoning each other up and meeting at various events. But one night, I had a phone call. My wife had run away with the pilot of the Goodyear airship and was living in Milan. So I was living in a little house in Edenbridge, not far from Dave Watts. And Paul said, bloody damp mould, I said, what do you mean, bloody damp mould? He said, yeah, it's a sort of molten metal damp mould. I said, what? I said, what happened? And he told me about the accident, and he was going to East Grinstead to have some plastic surgery. That's not very far from where you live, is it? He said. So I said, no. And I brought a picture of the house, that's the one. And because the house was empty, he took up residence with me and was able to come to folk sessions, because just up the hill was a really, really old pub that had folk sessions every week. And we could go up there and exchange these stories, which other people shouldn't hear, and play music. And it was terrific. And every now and then I'd drive him into East Grinstead and they'd do something, and then he'd come back and relax. And what fun it was. Now, after that, we sort of, well, I eloped with one of my students, and she's sitting there. And we sort of came to Somerset, in fact, to go caving every week. Every night, in fact, or every day. And lost touch with Paul for a long time. But eventually, he found touch with me again. And that's how we got back to being really, really great friends. And I shall miss him tremendously. And all the times we spent together are always going to... the thing is, I love the end bit in that book, which was just where I came in, where he came to stay with me. And thank goodness he did. I learned so much.
Now, luckily for you people, you don't have to listen to me droning on all of the time. I'm going to ask Jim Causley to come and relieve the tedium that may have developed as your eyes glaze over, hearing about Paul being such a wicked man and such a lovely man and all these other things.
There's other things. Right, listen to my drones instead. Jane asked if I'd do a couple of songs that I sang that Paul liked, so that narrows it down. Both of them happen to be covers, actually, by coincidence. Not traditional songs, but the first one I'll do is by a known songwriter called Rolf McTell, who, but it's not Streets of London, it's the other song he wrote, apparently inspired by the life of Dylan Thomas, when he was out chasing women, so I don't know why Paul liked this one. It's called Summer Girls. This summer will be different, I will move across the town. Promenade above the beach until my face turns brown. With my hands in my pockets and a casual stroll from the town beach to the docks, where the girls they walk in twos and threes, the pretty cotton frocks teased by the breeze. And I will find my only summer girl there for me. And I will assume the accent of some Yankee sailor boy, stranded between merchant ships with some time to enjoy, while a week or two down by the bay, tuppenny ice cream cones and petticoats and sandy kisses skin smooth as stones washed by the sea, and I will find my only summer girl there for me. And her name will be Pam or Ruth, so I'll be Chuck or Wayne. We will know and love each other, then I will explain how I haven't found a ship and that I live in the town. Before we share that cigarette, the waves of love will drown down by the sea. The lovely long-limbed, salted summer girl and me. She will not cry for my leaving, she will cry because I stay. She will cry for my deceiving, that we could meet every day. Well, this love affair, it grew so fast, because we'd have to part. And now we will part anyway. She will take my heart and I'll be free to find another summer girl who'll give it back to me. This next one is a song made popular by Bette Midland. Interesting choice. And not for me, it's quite a normal choice for me, but yeah. Often actually Paul would request this one and I hadn't sung it for ages, and think, but I can't remember how it goes, and then I'm disappointed by not singing it, so I better do it today. Well, I remember he sent me some of his memoirs in an email, and he kept on at me about reading that and had I read it. And I remember him saying to me, he said, "There's a bit in it that you'll like." You know, wink, wink, nudge. So I still haven't read it, mate. Right. Right, how's it go? It's in the same key, I'm afraid. I know these streets and these backyards, there's spotlights falling down. We come to where they're building now and ride our bikes around. You think I'm just a little kid, one trouble on the way. Well, I knew this place before you did, is all I've got to say. I'm only walking through these streets and all around. I'm only walking, I know this town. We come home through these fields at night about 1,000,000 times. I could walk the roads with my eyes closed, all the paths beside. Well, I know the boy who broke this fence, I know his brother too, but they'd never give me half a chance if I led on to you. I'm only walking through these streets and all around. I'm only walking, I know this town. We dam the streams, we days in our sleep, and where they're cold and where they're deep. We go down to the bowling alley by Smokes and Dentine. I'll find some loose change every day under that Coke machine. Will you size me up as you drive by like there was some big deal? Well, I know so much you'll never find from there behind the wheel. Behind the wheel, I'm only walking through these streets and all around. I'm only walking. I know this town. I know this town. I know this town.
Oh Lord, me again. I'll backtrack to the 60s just for one little paragraph. As I mentioned, Paul was often away and he was completely honest about having other girlfriends. One day he phoned to tell me he'd got a new car and was going to see Molly and Mike in Braunton. Why didn't I come over and he'd take me out in his Mark 9 Jag? So we met up there, but I had come to a decision. He was not given to showing his feelings, so I finally concluded that we should split up. Okay, he said, and drove me home. I was heartbroken, but decided it had been for the best. That might have been the end of the story, but years later, a phone call changed everything. I'd been living in the US for several years, but had returned in December 1977, just for a holiday, so I thought. I'd barely had time to unpack when the phone rang, and I answered. Could I speak to Mrs. Hammond, please? Yes, who's calling, I said. Oh, it might be you I want to talk to. Is that Jane? Yes. Well, it's me, Paul Snow. How did you know I was back? I didn't know you'd been away. We agreed to meet up. The colour drained from my parents' faces. I just intended to show him what he'd let go, but Nana, his dog, approved of me and we had a great time at another folk club. After this, Paul went to see some friends and told them that I was the girl he was going to marry. They did point out it might be an idea to ask me first. The nearest he ever got to proposing was to ask what my views on marriage were. I was going to go up to London for my flight back to the States, and Paul was going up there too for the Model Engineers exhibition, so he offered me a lift. That should have been the end of it, but somehow we'd become besotted with each other, only complicated by the fact that I had a boyfriend back in the States. I stayed in London for a couple of days and then decided that my future had to be with Paul. He and Nana were delighted to welcome me back. In my strange Anglo-US accent I said, this is going to be one dynamite trip. And it was. He lived hand to mouth in a rented cottage, and there were times when we were very hard up, scratching around to find the money just to pay the rent. He could live like that, very Micawberish. Something would turn up. And when you're young, it's not too difficult. I remember a time when he decided to sell a cabinet he had so he'd have enough money for the rent and petrol for the car. He said, if this doesn't sell, we won't have enough money to buy the petrol to get back. We'll be right up the creek. Oh, I said, El Creco. I had lots of El Creco moments until I managed to get some work, first as a temp and then more permanent employment. Let me tell you about some other friends and moments in our lives where we were unencumbered by mortgages or babies. I should point out that after this, just to give you a heads up, Stephen Locke, you're going to be up next, so after I've gone through. Again, this is just to give a picture of some of the different people that we knew through the years. So Bill Leake, Patrick Cotter and Practical Jokes. Two more different people than Bill Leake and Patrick Cotter might not be found, the common denominator being Paul Snow. Bill Leake was a scrap metal dealer who loved to tease Paul about how much he could get for scrapping Paul's workshop. Metal was for breaking up and selling. Patrick Cotter was an antique dealer and sometime antique shop proprietor. He didn't actually like customers unless they were other dealers, so the shop was more a showcase for them. It would sometimes bat away a customer's inquiries for a price. It's not for sale, and then hustle them out. I'm closing now. Bill often got work clearing redundant sites, old hospitals, laundries and such like, and Paul would go along to help with shifting some of the bigger, heavier items. He told me that Bill would sing as he worked, and they would be quite strange choices, such as Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. Highly unlikely. He found a mannequin, this is Bill, he found a mannequin in his travels which enabled him to alarm sharp-eyed motorists who would see an arm trapped in a boot or legs protruding from the tarpaulin on his lorry. He too could get annoyed with punters when they tried to haggle over ridiculously small sums. On one occasion, someone offered £4 when Bill had said £5 for something. They were beside a river, so Bill looked at the item and looked at the river. He said, it's not worth a fiver, it's not worth bothering, threw it in the river. Then he said, you can have it for nothing if you go and get it. I don't know how or why Bill called on Patrick and Janet when they lived in Morsham Bishop, but he was very proud of a vehicle he was driving at that time. The weather was not good. In fact, the snow was coming down quite heavily. Both Patrick and Janet were quite worried, but Bill brushed aside their concerns. His motor would get through anything. Sadly, his optimism was misplaced and Bill was stranded there for several days until the roads were finally cleared. Patrick was a good woodworker, and both Paul and Patrick knew their stuff. Like all genuine experts, they would say when they didn't know about something and try to find out more. Patrick once made a chest trying out different styles and methods of woodworking, and pleased with his efforts, carved the date 1st of July 1976, but like this, 1776, which rather amused him. He sold it, having said that he had made it, and was alarmed several years later to find that it was on sale in the shop, not only as an antique, but one which demonstrated previously unknown characteristics in an early date, such as the world of antiques full of sharp charlatans and experts. Paul loved some of the little projects Patrick brought to him. There were the charming silver sugar tongs with a piece missing. Paul was keen to do some lost wax casting, and here was the very thing. I came home from work one day and wondered what the terrible smell was coming from the oven. Oh, Paul had been using the kitchen for mould making and burning out the wax. Of course, how silly of me. He made a beautiful job of the tongs. Paul loved such challenges. They could never pay for the time and effort, but that was never the point. Another time, Patrick had bought a very plain pistol from a chap they both rather despised, another expert. Patrick asked Paul if he could do some work on this pistol to make it look a bit fancy, and Paul gladly did the job. A week later, Patrick collected it and was delighted to report that he'd taken it back to the chap, who didn't recognise what had been done and confidently declared it was a rather special item which he would buy to keep in his own collection. Now, we loved Patrick and Janet. Didn't we love you? We loved you. They were notorious for being late. So if they were coming for a meal, you made sure it was something that could cook for several hours and remain edible. On this one occasion, it was a lovely summer's evening, and we wondered what to do whilst we waited for them to arrive. I shall have to digress a little to provide a picture. Paul did occasional work for the museum in Exeter and noticed that they were disposing of some stuffed animals that got some bug which they didn't want to get into the rest of the collection. Paul is, I think, well known for hating things going to waste, so he brought several bagfuls home with him. They proved very handy in the winter months as we shivered by the fire until one of us would say, chuck another bowl on the fire. We decided to set up an outdoor scenario. A rather wobbly formica table was dragged out of Paul's workshop and 4 rickety chairs set around. They arrived just as darkness was descending. We thought we'd dine al fresco, we cried. Janet's face was a picture. I brought out a tureen and underneath it, well, I'll just announce, rat à l'orange. Their relief was palpable, but they did love the joke. Another time, we had a friend coming round to see us. We were not at the time amply supplied with stuffed animals, so we had the largest log in the living room, which we were sawing up. Well, another scenario beckoned. Me, poor downtrodden wife, sawing the log. Paul said, oh, I didn't say it. Another time, we had a friend coming round to see us. I missed a bit. Even with my glasses on. So we had a friend coming round to see us, and so we had this log, and we decided to set up a little scenario for this person. Me, poor downtrodden wife, sawing the log. Paul sat in a comfy chair with his feet up on the log, of course. Knock at the door, it's open, he calls, and as they come in, to me, get up and make my friend a coffee. Me, shall I finish sawing first or get the coffee now? But we ruined it by falling about laughing. Right, and now I will stop gassing for a minute and call on Stephen Locke to come and talk about how he got to know Paul. Thank you.
Is that all right? Can I be heard adequately? My experience of sound systems in North Curry Village Hall isn't very encouraging. Anyway, hello everybody, and thank you very much, Jane, for giving me this opportunity of sharing a few memories of Paul. Many of the themes have already come up. I'm glad to see I'm not the only one with notes. The purpose of these notes is to keep me from going off-piste, because it's so easy to do so. So I met Paul first in 1972, when, for my sins, I was appointed as director of the Royal Albert Memorial Museum, which from now on I will just say RAM, because it's much easier to say and is a commonly used abbreviation for that great museum locally. Now, I don't want to reminisce about all those years at RAM, because we're here to talk about Paul. But some background will be a good thing, because first of all, it's how I met Paul, and secondly, his connection with the museum was actually very important to the museum, and I think Paul also. So I just want to give a little bit of background to the museum as it was in 1972. Like many important provincial museums in this country, between the wars it had suffered. And it had had a particularly bad World War II, when the museum had been requisitioned by some obscure branch of the army, with a commanding officer who was completely ignorant and unsympathetic about its contents, with the result that the collections were neglected at best. So there was a lot to do after the war, but unfortunately that was a period, and this was typical of many of these museums, when the directors tended to be people who couldn't make it an academic life, and working in a museum was sort of reasonably respectable sort of occupation, but you know, not good enough to be professors, to put it crudely. And that, you know, was really, so the museum declined over that period from the sort of 1940s through to the late 60s, really. I followed a chap called Paddy Boyden, who was the first of what you might call the sort of progressive modernising directors. But the important thing was to try to modernise the museum without losing contact with its quite extraordinary, diverse and important collections. But the level of neglect that had gone on for decades before was going to take a long, long time to correct. The collections were, frankly, in an absolutely dreadful state. And our main focus was trying to get them back into some sort of order. And that brings me to Paul. It comes as a surprise to many people to find that Exeter has got a firearms collection at all. It's not something that is widely promoted in museums, perhaps for obvious reasons, but the point has already been made that what appealed to Paul about firearms was the engineering craftsmanship that they involved. I doubt it was not a military firearms collection. It consisted of sporting firearms, personal firearms. To the ordinary person, it might be much better to describe them as antiques or decorative art even, but engineering craftsmanship above all. And Paul had been recruited, or recruited himself, I don't know how, when I arrived, and giving somebody free rein in the firearms collection, particularly when many of them are very unique and very valuable, that involves a degree of trust. And I was reassured by the curators, first of all, that, Paul was safe. And bearing in mind, he had now assumed his piratical eye patch. And we must remember this is over 50 years ago. Attitudes were so different. People made judgments that we would be frightened to make today. The museum's extremely laid back. Museum people could cope with this. But I had a lot of explaining to do to chairmen of museum committees that this piratical character, was a safe pair of hands for our much prized firearms collection. The chap who'd been director through the war years, and afterwards, not Paddy Boylan, I must excuse Paddy Boylan from this, had the propensity of many directors at that time. They took a very close personal interest in the collection. It's a setting sin in museum people. It's natural, isn't it? The trouble is that it can get beyond the bounds. And this particular director got very interested in the firearms and decided that he would improve them. And so he would sit at his desk. I don't know if the desk stood in, it was the directorial desk. It was a very big Victorian desk made by Harry Hems, the famous cabinet maker in Exeter. It had many, many drawers and many cupboards, very useful for hiding things. This director used it, Paddy Boylan used it, I inherited it. He'd sit at his desk and he'd have a revolver on it, and a screwdriver and a pair of pliers. And he'd sort of unscrew a likely looking screw, then he'd unscrew another screw, and by the time we got to the third screw, of course the whole thing virtually exploded. Springs, cams, levers, triggers flew everywhere. So they'd all be scooped up and put into one of those wooden cigar boxes. Now every museum person of any antiquity will recognise these wooden cigar boxes. They were used for everything. Put it in one of the drawers of Harry Hems's desk and start on the next one. So one of Paul's main tasks was to put these back together again after these sort of depredations. I would describe him really as the sort of surveyor of the firearms collection. It was not a popular collection with the curators. It was outside their comfort zone. It's, after all, a very specialist field. Not many museums outside of military museums have got these firearms collections. And Paul recognised the importance and the value. In particular, he recognised the special one-off nature of many of the firearms that were in the collection. And he knew what to avoid. That's an absolutely key thing. He knew what to avoid in terms of dealing with them. They're very complicated things to do with firearms. A lot of bureaucracy. We had an enormous firearms licence. It was an extraordinary thing. And from time to time, when the police had nothing better to do, they would come and check our firearms licence, and there was nothing that the coppers liked more than showing off their skill, as they thought, in handling these firearms. And one of Paul's job was to, for heaven's sake, stop them trying to sort of pull them apart or fire them or anything else that they thought they would do for a pleasant afternoon off in Ram. So, his metalworking skills have been mentioned a lot. The other thing that I particularly remember him for in the museum was as a locksmith. You can have no conception of the number of locks and keys that there are, or certainly were, in a museum in those days. So we're talking about, you know, keep saying, back over 50 years ago, not just all the keys to the rooms and the doors, but hundreds of cabinets, literally hundreds of cabinets, most of which have become completely disassociated from their keys. And the head attendant had a big biscuit tin full of keys. No key was ever thrown away. And the head attendant would, you know, when faced with a lock that wouldn't open or close, would go through this tin. His second port of call, if that didn't work, was to ask me, simply because my surname is Long. And it turned out actually I had quite a bit of, I was quite, you know, good at this. I could somehow identify the appropriate key. But more often than not, Paul was called in to try to sort out one of these recalcitrant locks. Now, we did try to pay him. This is very appropriate after what James had said. We did try to pay him, but I was actually responsible for the city treasurer, and he required some sort of paper trail before he'd write out a cheque. An order might be useful, and above all, an invoice. But Paul, providing an invoice, that was, you know, I kept saying, Paul, give us an invoice and we'll pay you. We'd like you to do more work, not less, but we can't pay. But, you know, you all know Paul as well as I do, so, you know, that was really asking a bit too much. So, that trust which we put in Paul in terms of dealing with the firearms collection, in my case, turned in to a friendship which has lasted really for 50 years. And that's why I've dwelt on it for a bit, because it really is sort of quite important. Chess has already been mentioned. We used to play chess from time to time. It was something we had in common. We were both rather indifferent players, actually. Good enough to put a game together, but not so good that we were ever competitive. And I guess, you know, we sort of won and lost equally, but we didn't really mind as long as we could get a decent game. Paul would come to our house to play, and I think more often than not, probably on his way to sing somewhere. And that brings me to a particularly grateful memory I have, which was Paul introducing me to Martin Carthy. Now I realise that I'm totally surrounded by folkies, and you all know a lot more about this than I do, and in particular Paul's immersion in the folk scene, but of course it wasn't the only thing in his life. Anyway, Paul made sure that I went with him to hear Martin Carthy sing in the most traditional of circumstances above a pub in Helverton. And Martin's signature tune at that session was the famous Flower of Serving Men. And I was absolutely transfixed. I'd never heard anything like it before. This was in the early 1970s. I don't know how often that song is sung. You will know. With Martin singing it, it had three perfectly balanced elements. Obviously his perfect male folk voice, his wonderful guitar playing, deceptively simple, but in fact very subtle and attuned to the lyrics. But the lyrics, as sung on Martin's version, is a long ballad, in which just about every European folk motif is woven into this most compelling narrative. It was a perfect performance, which I have never forgotten. I went out and bought the album, of which it's a centrepiece, Shearwater. Still have it, still play it from time to time, and it would certainly be one of my Desert Island discs. Was it an enjoyable song to listen to? To those of you who know it, the lyrics are surely the most brutal lyrics perhaps ever written for a folk song. Paul was very, already been mentioned, Paul was very fond of butterflies. I will always associate him with butterflies, but two species in particular. The first was the brimstone. Paul planted a buckthorn, which is the larval food plant for the brimstone, in his garden. It more or less guaranteed to attract brimstones. It's almost like magnetic. And he always tried to breed them. If he could save the caterpillars from the blue tits, he would try to breed them. He was successful more than once, and he would always send me a little video of their progress. They've got particularly pretty chrysalises. And then later on in the year, Paul and Jane would make a pilgrimage down to Dawlish Warren, which is a very good spot for butterflies if you go the right day, but particularly to see a small copper. And it became a sort of annual, actually Nina, my wife, and myself went down with them at least once and saw small coppers. I mean, they're not rare, but they're elusive. It's very chancy whether you see them or not, like a lot of butterflies. But it became an annual event for Paul to phone us up from Dawlish Warren and tell us what he was looking at. Now, finally, and on a rather, I hope not too personal a note, but this is after all a personal occasion. Despite Paul's own health problems, he was always very greatly and very sincerely concerned for my health. Now this went back to 2004, when I was retiring from my last paid job with Hampshire, and intending to come back to East Devon, which we wanted to do. And Paul was very keen that we should do so. Just this time, it seems to happen to a lot of people, had a very serious cancer, and details of which, of course, are completely irrelevant. But of all people, acquaintances and friends outside of the family, Paul was the most concerned. And this was particularly demonstrated by the claim that it was a highlight of his life. Now, those are his words, and Jane will bear me out on this. These are his words. It was a highlight of his life when I phoned him to tell him I'd had a clear scan. And at the time, he was taking one of his breaks and was visiting the famous and spectacular Falkirk Wheel, which is an engineering marvel which lifts boats on the Forth and Clyde Canal. And the two things came together, and I say, Jim will bear me out, but he never ceased to say how delighted he was to receive the news on such a memorable occasion, and would frequently say that and tell it to other people as well. It was one of his regular bits of communication. So Paul was somebody who gave a great deal but expected very little in return. So thanks for listening and giving me this opportunity of sharing a few memories of Paul with you. Thank you.
Right, well, Joel, were you?
Oh, yes.
going to have another little musical interlude. This is actually, Joel has written a tune called The Snow Jig in Paul's memory, which is we're very grateful for. So thank you. And this is going to be fun.
We have not played together before.
They have all played it, but not together. Right, so I'm going to remove myself now.
Question, are we all in tune with each other? Can I just tune up for a minute?
Okay, so I've known Paul for quite a long time. I can't actually remember the first time I met Paul. Oh, sorry.
Hi, good afternoon. I've known Paul and Jane for many years. I can't actually remember when I first met. It must have been when I lived in Tiverton and ran the bookstore there. Yes. I can't even remember when I was even playing then or not. But, and then I lost contact with them when I moved to Exeter, and then I suddenly saw Paul at a session with the violin. I was quite surprised because I didn't know he played the violin, so that's how I sort of re-established my friendship with Paul, and Jane would come along as well, so I was to see them both. And of course Paul was very much a beginner, and you know, it's coming on gradually, you know, it was nice to see. And I have to say, likewise, with the last gentleman who just spoke, I unfortunately had an illness, and Paul was always very concerned about that too. He'd always ask me about my kidney transplant, and when that failed, you know, he was quite concerned. And I had the second one, and he would say, oh, I hope it's, you know, and this is when Paul was obviously quite ill, so anyway. So this is called The Snow Jig. It came to me when I heard about Paul's passing. We even played it together. So Jane very kindly asked me if I'd come along and perform it with everyone here. And we've all had obviously contact with Paul over the years, especially Stephen. His son.
Do you need the dots, or does everyone want the dots, or is everyone pretty?
Yeah, do you remember what you were doing though?
Do you want us to run the 8 half circle through, which one do you start from the beat?
Yeah. Sorry, I'll be in the show, I'm not
Yeah.
Right, Stephen's now going to tell you a bit about his perspective on being the son of Paul.
The son of the one and only. Have you got my one? You good? Right. Okay, oh, that's very sensible. So I must give two apologies quickly. One is that I'm going to go a little bit off script for a moment because some of the recollections already have reminded me of one extra memory which I must share with you all. And the second is just for any offence caused by any of these stories. So I remember the first competition that I ever entered. I was 3 years old. It was a colouring competition. The winner would receive a bed shaped like Thomas the Tank Engine. And to my train-obsessed 3-year-old mind, there was no finer thought. So I paid close attention to getting in the right shade of blue, and I worked hard to keep the colours inside the lines. Mum, the regretful cynic, voiced aloud to Dad that the competition organisers would probably just pick a drawing out of a hat rather than paying any attention to the quality of the work. And either she was right, or the organisers suspected I'd had some illicit help, because the drawing they ultimately picked was just a mass of squiggles all over the line drawing, not even the suggestion of attempt at accuracy. I was gutted. But my dad, always up for righting the scales of injustice, wasn't going to let his boy be disappointed like that, not after he'd seen him work as hard at it as any 3-year-old Thomas fan could. So armed with only the pictures of the bed from the magazine competition page, the given measurements in the description, and his own extensive knowledge of all aspects of woodworking, he built and painted a replica. Or perhaps I shouldn't call it a replica, because the bed he made was even better than the one in the magazine. I kept that bed for several years, long past when one would normally have grown out of such a bed, because it wasn't just a bed, was it? It was a sign of Dad's love for me, and his concern for justice. To be clear, though, as I'm sure you're all aware, straightforward, upright honour and chivalric conduct wasn't quite Dad's style. He was not afraid of telling the odd fib, though as a young child, my more naive approach didn't always help him there. I recall we visited the Coombe Martin Wildlife and Dinosaur Park back when I was a dinosaur-obsessed 6-year-old, and I was fascinated by one of the large dinosaur statues that stood on the grass beyond a low rope fence. Dad suggested we could go and take a closer look. Being able to read at that point, I was halted in my tracks by the presence of the authoritative "Keep off the grass" sign, which stood unmistakably in front of the fence. Dad assured me it would be fine, and so I had joined him in crossing the fence. No sooner had we taken 2 strides across the grass when a park keeper shouted at us, "Did you see the sign? Keep off the grass!" My dad, trying to smooth things over, said, "Oh, sorry about that. My son wanted to see the dinosaurs up close. We didn't see the sign." I immediately proved myself the single worst accomplice in the history of history. "I told you the sign said not to go on the grass, Daddy! I told you!" That wasn't the only time I got Dad in trouble, of course. When I was about 4 or 5, for context, Dad used to do silly impressions of Hitler. No doubt inspired by the famous "Don't Mention the War" episode of Fawlty Towers, which little me took to be the very pinnacle of raucous humour. I would fall about laughing as Dad, who by the way did not speak a word of German, posed, gesticulated and yelled nonsensical quasi-German phrases like "Ich haben Sie mit den Schweigen." Well, you do whatever you can to make a child laugh, don't you? And it wasn't like I was somehow going to cause any offence, was it? So at the age of 4, I was diagnosed with diabetes. So I had to go for regular checkups with Dr. Tripp and the diabetic nurse. One checkup, Dr. Tripp said, "Do you mind if this junior doctor sits in on our appointment?" No, we said, "That's fine." "She's in training at the moment," said Dr. Tripp. "She's from Germany." I looked up at my dad. "My daddy speaks German." "No, I don't, Stephen." "Yes, you do, Daddy." "No, I don't, Stephen. I really don't." "Yes, you do, Daddy." You go, and little blonde, blue-eyed me, looking like a poster child for the bloody Hitler Jugend, started chanting and goose-stepping around the office like John Cleese in Fawlty Towers, yelling pseudo-German, in which the only real discernible word was the word Schweinhund, an insult meaning pig dog, considered an old-fashioned swear word in German. The nurse was Danish, and hated Germans, and so she fell out laughing and had to leave the room. The German doctor sat there, stony-faced. And Dr. Tripp and my dad, well, they were just waiting for the ground to open up and swallow them. Dad laughed about it years later. I do want to go off script for a moment because there has been some mention of Dad's incredible driving journeys of all over the country for all sorts of things, whether it was his work, his folk music, his friends. And I have to add my own contribution to that. When I was about 16, 17, I was very, very keen to go and see Judas Priest perform the only show they were doing that year at the Royal Albert Hall. Amazing event. Absolutely had to go. My dad had no problem with this. I'd also put in for a folk singing competition, which was taking place on the Sunday. Also, no problem at all as far as Dad was concerned. What that actually meant was that Dad picked me up from Exeter College as I finished my day on the Friday, along with 2 friends that he was bringing up from Tiverton, drove us to London in immeasurably quick time, certainly not legal, arrived, had us go to the concert. We had a wonderful night. He went around London. He came back, picked us up, drove us back in the very, very, very early hours of Saturday morning. We got to sleep about 5 o'clock in the morning. My dad, already past retirement age, mind you, then drove me back to St Albans later that day to stay over, perform on the Sunday, and come back. More driving than you'd normally do in a long-distance lorry driving job, and he did it all post-retirement in a weekend. I felt it should be mentioned. Thank you, Dad. I got my voice back after the Judas Priest gig round about Sunday morning. Now, when I was young, we had a flat above the baby equipment shop which my parents ran, as well as a separate house just down the alleyway, where Mum still lives today. Dad did the repairs for the shop, and he also had a workshop at the house. But what always drew me to visit our house was the magnificent electric train set on the living room table, and also, if I may, the old Commodore 64 computer, which Dad had bought from a friend, and which was my first gaming console. I loved what I called going round to the house and gaming or playing with trains with my dad. On one occasion, when I was 8, Dad took me down to the basement of the house. I stared in wonder at the equipment there, his lathes and his Rose engine, unable to even fathom how much work and time and genius went into everything he did and made there. Dad gave me a glimpse, though, when he taught me how to turn a barleycorn pattern on his Rose engine, something I've always thought of as his specialty in ornamental turning, along with his ingenious stepped pattern on the sides of his round boxes. If you've seen it, you'll know it. I admit I couldn't remember how to do the pattern now, and there were probably several steps that my dad did for me without my realising it. All I remember is the importance of moving a peg 3 holes further anti-clockwise along the part of the Rose engine. But it was a tremendously exciting thing to learn from him, and to see him work on his lathes, wielding tools and levers and wheels with expert precision. And when a few years later I took woodworking class at school, I was the only one in the class who knew what a lathe was, let alone how to use one, albeit in only the most basic of ways. That was all thanks to watching my dad and his expert explanations of what he was doing. When it came to playing with him on the computer, my dad was not exactly your typical gamer. Where some people get frustrated when their game characters die or they lose a level, Dad would laugh heartily and say, especially of the 1984 game Jack Attack, "See, if the computer doesn't want you to win, you won't." His mirth at losing games wasn't confined to just Jack Attack. There was an old game called Samurai Warrior, which featured a karma meter, which went up and down according to the morality of your actions. If you were enough of an arsehole that your karma reached 0, your character would commit suicide in as graphic detail as could be managed on an 8-bit Commodore system. So what was my dad's favourite pastime? He would intimidate peasants until the phrase popped up on screen, "I have no honour, I must atone for my shame," and guffaw with laughter, reading the phrase out loud gleefully as Tujagi Yojimbo disemboweled himself on screen. I learned to find this amusing too, albeit not my personal style of gaming, and I think it did me a lot of good in teaching the young me the difference between games and electronic simulations and real life. A very pertinent lesson in today's world of immersive games and ubiquitous social media. Dad didn't change his playing style as my gaming systems updated. When I would invite him to play the zombie shooting game House of the Dead 2, for instance, with me on my Dreamcast, I always knew what I was getting myself into. Dad would certainly shoot at the zombies so long as they were the only things on the screen, and as Graham would have observed, he was a very good shot. But as soon as a civilian appeared on the screen, begging us to save them from the zombie menace, I knew they were doomed. Dad would fire a shot right at them, laughing uproariously as we lost thousands of points for killing the people we were meant to save. Discovering a cheat code that gave all the characters big heads was a delight for him, as he could more easily murder them as they came running towards us screaming, "Help me! Help me!" Dad was an excellent shot in real life, as well as in gaming, being both an experienced gunsmith and a veteran of national service, though thankfully never deployed to fight. And he taught me how to shoot with a low-powered air gun, which I bought from a family friend when I was 12. We shot it down the hall in the flat above the shop, using a target which Dad had made himself, any customers below being quite unsuspecting of the fact that some 9 feet above their head, a 12-year-old with an air rifle was gleefully shooting a paper target, imagining himself some great shot every time he actually hit the target itself. Meanwhile, Dad would line up a shot with his own air pistol, the trigger being too heavy for my 12-year-old me to even operate, and put a pellet, expertly, through the bullseye, to my wide-eyed admiration. His ultra-violent tendencies when gaming were a far cry from his nature in real life, though. His peaceful nature, not truly pacifist, but peaceful, was thoughtful and considered. I remember when we were discussing violence, that he never told me outright never to kill, or even that killing was automatically wrong. Indeed, he served in the Air Force for his national service, and even told me one other army he would willingly have served in, with the implicit willingness to kill that comes with that. But instead, he told me this, that once you take a life, you have taken something you can never give back. That phrase has always stayed with me, encouraging me to take a thoughtful approach to my morality rather than resting on assumptions, always asking whether this or that action is right or wrong in context, rather than simply repeating some rote-learned expression of public moral opinion. I can't thank him enough for encouraging me to think in this way, because I find it very helpful when I'm discussing complex moral and political questions, which I do a lot. Now finally, I would be remiss to talk about my dad without mentioning music. Music, music, music. Dad loved anything beautiful, from butterflies and flowers to the enamelled eggs made by his mother, from architecture to paintings, from brilliant films to beautiful women, obviously, and from ingenious clocks and mechanical creations to his own ornamental turning work. But music deserves a special mention. Dad was a great musician and singer who ran several folk clubs and had a burgeoning music career in the 60s. I sometimes wish he had been more keen to promote himself as a folk artist, not so much for the sake of success, as Dad disliked even the idea of being famous or even recognised by strangers in public, but because there might have been some recordings of his playing from the 60s for me to listen to. Dad loved showing me the recordings of his friends, singing and playing, from Martin Carthy and Dave Swarbrick to Martin Windsor and Red Sullivan, and I was always a little sad that there were no recordings of his own singing and playing. But I had something better than recordings of his past. When I took up the violin at the age of 7, Mum and Dad started taking me out to folk clubs to improve my playing and get the hang of public performance in a supportive environment, and he dusted off his beautiful old Levin guitar and came out singing. Dad's repertoire was varied and always entertaining, from old Hank Williams country classics to traditional folk songs, from dirty blues numbers to Rudyard Kipling poems set to music, and he loved as much to hear others' performances. Well, the good ones, anyway. I well remember the quiet groan of, "Oh no, not him again," which would emerge from the side of his mouth just loud enough for me to hear as some talentless hack came out to drone away 10 minutes of our lives we'd never get back. And he always encouraged people to try new things, to take delight in learning and singing and playing. And as I got older, and my playing started sounding a bit less like a strangled cat and a bit more like a violin, Dad invited me to jam with him, and we performed together many times, especially on country songs. He taught me guitar, though I could never get the hang of his claw-hammer fingerstyle technique, and in turn, I wound up teaching him violin, although teaching may be a bit of a generous word to describe my clumsy attempts to pass on my half-remembered beginning violin lessons from years before. My dad, of course, took it upon himself to improve, and he signed us both up to Rough Music, a folk music ensemble for musicians of any ability, which improved both our playing immeasurably. It was always quite a pleasant shock to hear how good we could all sound playing together, especially compared to how some of us, myself included, sounded on our own. Dad continued his playing and singing right up until the end of his life. Even in the last few weeks of his life, he was keen to pick up the violin or guitar and play as best he could, as his body devoted its strength to his doomed brave battle against cancer. One of the last things we did together, specifically as father and son, was to play the Singing Bird violin duet together. I think the one thing which always stands out in my memories of my dad, though, will always be his laughter. When I was young, my dad would read books to me at bedtime, but rather than the standard fairy tales or children's stories that other parents use to get their kids to fall asleep as soon as possible, Dad would read me the Red Dwarf novels. In one sequence, two characters remonstrate with each other about how they've made each other's lives difficult, and Dad had to pause for 5 full minutes, mid-sentence, as both of us laughed ourselves almost to death at one particularly good insult. I didn't even find out what it was for 2.5 of those minutes. He laughed freely and often at every type of humour. But whatever the type of humour, his laughter was an expression of pure joy. That was my dad as I knew him. Father, ornamental turner, eccentric gamer, musician, philosopher, and alongside it all, a bloody good laugh.
I've got a few more little bits from people who couldn't be here today who asked me to say something on their behalf. This first one is from Paul Stevens, and he says, I first met Paul Snow when I was a 15-year-old boy who had just started working with my grandfather. That was Norman Johnson, who people in the gun trade would know was very, very well known for bluing and browning the barrels of guns. I was in the workshop getting one of my daily tellings off when in came Paul. We chatted a bit and he told me to pay attention to what I was being told, as I was lucky to be learning my grandfather's trade. I met Paul twice back then in 1983 and he was always kind to me and offered good advice. My grandfather passed in 1985 and I did not see Paul again until 2023, some 40 years later. He had found out I was working again and where my workshop was. He called in to see me and we started putting the world to rights, having a good chat about the good old days. Within my trade, I had an ongoing problem with chemicals that had gone on for a good number of years. I explained that one of the chemicals I could no longer get, only for him to say, I've got a bottle of that in my shed. Long story short, he dropped it off and it solved a lot of problems. We were able to get more of the same made, and via Paul's act of kindness, he helped lift a massive weight off my shoulders, and I will be forever grateful for that. It is no coincidence that he appeared when he did. I believe some people come into your life when you need help, and that is what Paul did for me. We had some more phone calls and swapped some emails, but sadly Paul passed before we could meet up again. I will miss the chats, but I will think of him often and smile at some of the things he came out with, and always be grateful for his help. And this is from Tony Bestwick, who is a jeweller, and Paul did some work for him, and he says, as we will sadly not be able to be with you on the 8th of March, I would be most grateful if you would read out its letter on my behalf. I was honoured over many years to count Paul as a friend. Kind, thoughtful, and always ready to help with his time, encouragement and advice, Paul was, as you all know, a brilliant engineer. I often thought that the term, the impossible today, miracles in two, was coined just for Paul, though he was always too modest to admit it. I well remember one day many years ago when Paul came with me to London to collect from Hatton Garden a rolling mill far too heavy for one person to lift. Together we struggled with this heap of iron, neatly wrapped by the cellar, which made it harder to carry, through the tube and back to Waterloo for the journey home, all carried out in the spirit of happy friendship that was Paul's hallmark. We had a very nice day. Paul made some tools for me on and off over the years, and they were all made with consummate skill. Paul could do things that couldn't be done, and I know he often chuckled when he had made yet another perfect fluted punch and die, which someone had told him was impossible. The impossible was never impossible for Paul, just maybe more difficult. And all this from a small basement workshop crammed to bursting with machines that were too close together to swing a cat. That is one definition of genius, someone who can produce amazing things without having the tools and space that would normally be required to make them. I've very much valued Paul's friendship over the years. I regret not being able to spend more time with him, but I have many happy memories. He would often phone someone and say in his distinctive but quiet voice, "Hello, this is the tax man." I think Paul's was a life well lived, a life of giving of himself and his wonderful talents to others. Not only did I value his friendship, but I was very proud to have known him. And this from a friend in Newcastle, Newcastle area, I can't remember, Hilary Rawlins, and she wrote, "I'm so sorry to hear your news. Paul was such a lovable rogue, full of energy and always ready to enjoy a laugh. I know we didn't spend much time together, but when I met you at Southfield Folk Club, I knew straight away that you two were what I call good uns, and I was happy to be as supportive as I could be when you were visiting your lad in Newcastle, and I appreciated your return hospitality when I popped in and stopped overnight when I was down south. I think I was probably doing a folk camp, but it's all a bit hazy now. I don't travel much these days, but will raise a glass to my favourite pirate and think of you both. When you, yes, with love and sorrow, Hilary." And now Stephen will read another one.
So this one, please do bear in mind, this is being read on behalf of somebody else. This is from Nicola Clark. Always naughty but nice, Paul adopted the persona of a lovable reprobate, a piratical rascal. And very good fun it was too. But in addition, there was such a kind, thoughtful, nature-loving, talented and imaginative man under that costume. Occasionally, I'd answer the phone all unawares on a washing-up morning to be assailed by a person who introduced himself as "my French lover" in an extraordinarily unconvincing French accent. I didn't have to guess twice. It was Paul up for a chat and a laugh about life in general, music, people, art. He was so skillful himself, yet very modest. He spoke vigorously against things he didn't approve of, but his heart was soft for beauty, whether that of butterflies or carving or music. He was full of contradictions and surprises. I want to share one particular memory for which I am most grateful. One year at the Bideford Folk Festival, Paul dared me to dress in an outrageous fashion to perform some of my more risque songs. Until then, I had been relying on the shock effect of singing filth while dressed as demurely as Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music. On his advice, I went out and procured second-hand a pair of witchy black Winklepecker stiletto heels, a one-piece combination of very short shorts and waistcoat made of grey pinstripe suit material, and a pink boa. This tasteless combination enhanced my singing about a gallery girl to great acclaim and initiated a practice of dressing ridiculously, which became practically de rigueur. French lovers speak again. Thank you, Paul, for your inspiration. I didn't really know Paul well enough to be able to comment on his life story or achievements, but his generous, maverick spirit informed everything he did and leaves a lasting and deeply lovable impression.
Now, is it Peter that's going to be speaking for us, or is it going to be a collection of you? We didn't have a chance to talk, but oh,
I joined the ornamental turners in 1980. And then sometime between then and now, Paul turned up. I've got no recollection, apart from the fact that, you're who else you knew? You're from Wales? I said, no. But he kept saying that every time he rang up, hello, boyo. Just because I happened to live 100 yards inside the Welsh country. And we got on like a house on fire. His sense of humour was very similar to mine, which was disgusting.
I think just not close enough.
I need to, oh, wow. I can hear myself. He was, as everybody said so far, he was an extremely clever man and very generous with his information, his knowledge and his help. I remember telling him once I was making a particularly difficult cutting frame for ornamental turning, and I could manage the circular bit, no problem at all. But this had to have an oblong square right through the middle of it, with one edge of the square on the centre line. And Paul said, oh, I'll come and help you with that. I'll be up next week sometime because we're going to look at some metal in Wales. And he turned up and he said, this is what you want, and produced a jig out of his pocket that he made and case hardened, and it fitted perfectly and made the job absolutely professional. You wouldn't take anything for it except cheese scone.
oh yeah,
Cheese scone. You like my wife's cheese scone. A lot of the members of the Ornamental Turning Society spoke to Paul, and they got on quite well. I've got a couple of... all right. I'm not used to this, as you can tell. This is from somebody called Jeremy Salisbury. I have good reason to be grateful to Paul. When I first took a piece of turning to the exhibition of ornamental turners meeting a good many years ago, I had been a member for over 20 years but never shown my work. With great trepidation, I put this piece on display. And almost immediately Paul sought me out and took me up to the cafeteria at Baden-Powell House. He was very keen to hear how I did my work, very encouraging that I should bring it to meetings. He was a stimulus to me to keep working. Later, Jane and Paul visited my workshop where they both took great interest in my turning equipment. That was it. That's it.
that's it.
Fine. I knew Paul was something to do with guns, or knew something about guns, but I wasn't really listening when he talked about it. And I remember we went to Brockhampton Court, up near Bromyard, and had a look round, and there on the wall was what appeared to be a gun, but I looked at it and it was just like a bit of rusty old metal and a lump of wood strapped together. So I took a photograph of it, thinking, I know somebody who know what this is. So I sent it to Paul, and immediately he rang me up, right in the middle of where you're not supposed to ring, and he said, oh, that's a post gun. He says it's used for shooting flocks of whatever it is, or most usually for shooting poachers. That's what they were used for. So I haven't forgotten that. Oh yes, his workshop. I envy his workshop from the point of view of whatever he's got in it, but not envy it because it's down steep stairs. And my workshop is under the house as well, so mine gets damp, but it's, yeah. I don't know what else to say. David, you want to say anything? Or?
Not really. I'm happy to. All I'd say is, it's only events like this that you get to learn what you didn't know about that person. We all know him for the little bits that we know.
He was very good with jokes, as you probably know. I did bring a few jokes up, but some I couldn't put out because they were Paul's jokes, Paul's type jokes. But what he did say, and this is when he found out he got whatever he got, and he said, there were two chaps in a pub, and one said to the other, said, have you seen so-and-so lately? And I said, the big sea got it. And the first person said, no, he drowned, did he? That was rather pause.
And now we have Michael Wright to just say a few words.
Very few words. I don't think I really need the microphone, do I? Just briefly, like Peter, I joined the Ornamental Turners, really weird society, in the 1970s. I don't know when I first met Paul there, but of course once I met him, I couldn't forget him. What I liked about Paul was he knew an awful lot, but he was very modest with what he knew, until somebody pretended he knew something, and Paul could find him out. Then he'd take that chap to the cleaners. And that was a wonderful characteristic. He really couldn't bear the bluffers. And what I admired about Paul was the beautiful work he did with very modest equipment. He didn't need expensive, elaborate stuff. He just got on with his expensive, elaborate fingers.
And now I've got Paul Morris to say a few words, I believe.
Thank you very much. I shall try and avoid the microphone. I've always been rather scared of them, but if you can't hear me, maybe you'll put your hands up. Just to say very briefly that I have a few reminiscences of Paul, but many of the things which perhaps I would have said have already been said. So I want to confine myself to two themes only, gratitude and coincidence. Gratitude and coincidence. Now, I actually knew several people who knew Paul, but we never met. So one or two of you here will know the decidedly uneccentric gentleman, Braxton Reynolds, one or two people here, and Braxton Reynolds was the analytical chemist par excellence. He looked rather like St James Robinson Justice, and as a young undergraduate he befriended me because we were both members of the Chemical Society, which is where I studied chemistry at Exeter University. But he mentioned Paul Snow, but we never met. A little bit later on, I needed a component for my pipe organ. This particular component I needed was a piece of electronics, and it was suggested to me that somebody, John Wilman, who's here, had something which would be very handy to me, and it was from Paul Snow. So once again, the name Paul Snow came up, and I thought, one of these days, I shall meet this gentleman. Well, going back to Braxton once again, he was telling me these stories about this incredible gentleman who single-handedly took on Billy Conley, I think it was, or whatever the chap's name was, headbutted him and had a major fracas in several of the London clubs. And I thought to myself, this must really be quite a character. Now, I first met Paul through tightly clad leather butts. Tightly clad leather butts, and I think I must explain this. Yes, so tightly clad leather butts. And I was also interested in antique firearms. No license needed for this one, by the way, and it's not loaded, I don't think. And this is an antique weapon which stores its air inside the butt, and it's made to look presentable by tightly cladding it, you see, it all makes sense, tightly cladding it with leather. But I had no idea where to get the leather that was needed. Somebody said, you ought to try Paul Snow. And I thought, right, I must meet this chap. Thank you, Judith. She gets a fiver for that. And so when I finally met him, he was able to recommend the leather that I should get, and of course I discovered that he was not only an enthusiastic firearm collector, but he knew so much about them, and this is a job that I did with some of his guidance many years later, so I'll leave that there. So the gratitude which I have for him was helping me with that, but also far more deeply, because I'm one of these people who suffers quite badly with depression in the wintertime. And it was Paul who was able to shake me up enough to get me out of bed sometimes and say, I won't use the words he said, they were very Anglo-Saxon, of course you'll understand. He got me back up again when other people would have sort of given me platitudes and pleasantries. Paul knew what to say to me. but there were some coincidences that ran very deep in our lives, because although lots of people knew him and they mentioned him to me, I didn't expect this to extend to the other side of the world. But one of the things I do is I make these wax cylinder phonograms, and these are wax cylinders that you can record your voice on an Edison phonograph. I often went to America, met many people there, one of whom was a gentleman called John Lampert. You won't know John Lampert, but there's somebody here who knows him rather well.
Yes,
and,
lived there for several years.
Indeed. So when we got talking about America, and Paul said, where did you go? New York, New Jersey. Oh, phonograph. Did you ever meet a chap called John Lampert? Knew him very well. The coincidences were there. It was just absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Here's another coincidence which I'll mention very, very briefly. We all have crises in our lives. Some of them are easier to talk about than others. My workshop burned down. It was made of wood. I was heating stuff inside it, and the heat and the wood got together. The workshop burned down, and I lost nearly everything. I was very upset about that. Very, very upset indeed. And in a way that I can't explain really adequately, I felt so low that I started having some very, very dark thoughts indeed. You know what I'm talking about. And Paul too, at about the same time, had a crisis which, once again, is of a personal nature, and I can't talk about it, but he too felt very, very low. And us two lowards, if there is such a word, we sort of buoyed ourselves up together. And that was a strange coincidence, but I always remember this, and I'll conclude with this. Paul said to me, I have a mobile phone which I keep always on, it's always by my side, and if you ever feel so low that you just need someone to talk to, or, he said, somebody just to know you're listening or you're there, I'm there for you. Now, there aren't too many people in this world who I've ever come across who've been like that. And I wanted to publicly just say, we've lost a wonderful person, and all of us here have lost a good friend, and just to say publicly, thank you, Paul, for all you were to me. Thank you very much.
Me again. But I am speaking other people's words. Hazel and Paul, they're going to... When I've just read these couple of bits, if you wouldn't mind. Right. So this is from someone called Susan Alexander. I regularly visited my friend who lived a few doors down from Paul and would always stop and have a chat with him in passing. I was chatting to my friend about how I had always wanted to play the fiddle, as I was brought up with lots of Irish music, as my dad loved listening to it. My friend said, you should speak to Paul, he plays fiddle. It was a lovely sunny day, and after chatting to Paul, he brought his fiddle round to the garden, and we had fun whilst he helped me make my first scraping cat yelling sounds. But most importantly, he said, you should try to play. I only started to play 10 years ago, and I'm much older than you. It's not too late to learn, you won't regret it, and it is very addictive. I thanked him for his wise words. A couple of days later, there was a knock at my friend's door, and there was Paul with a violin case. He said, I've got this old violin, I've tuned it up, would you like to borrow it and see how you get on? You just need a bow, but you can get one for about £20. I was so touched by his generous offer and totally unaware that his kindness would set me on the most fantastic journey. I was so happy driving up the A303 with the fiddle in the boot. 6 months passed and I tried but was unable to find a way to get started. Just when I thought I should give up, a chance conversation with someone at a local folk club put me in touch with a wonderful lady who offered to give me a few free lessons to get me started. Fast forward 9 years on, I'm now a fully fledged fiddle player. The lady who is called Alison turned out to be a fantastic teacher, mentor and now a best friend too. We have played at folk clubs, festivals, parties, barn dances, charity events, sessions and busts. I've just had the best time of my life. Unfortunately, my friend moved, so I didn't see Paul for a while, but we did catch up at Sidmouth Folk Week in 2018, and he got the chance to hear me play, and I got the chance to say a massive thank you to him for his encouragement and kindness. Can I say that? And this is received very late because Tony, his brother, and Duncan's dad, He's not well enough to come down, and he's got lots of things wrong with him. And he had a few words to say, and it's sad to say that they really didn't get on. There was a 5-year gap in their ages, and what we want in another is, but I'll just read what it says, he mentioned the 5-year age difference. Their different interests meant that they were not particularly close, as the only thing they had in common was being brothers. But here are a few of his memories from later on. He says, I can remember when I returned to Exeter and stayed with my parents and going to wake Paul up in the morning. When I went into his room, with his eyes closed, he reached his cigarettes, lit one, and as he took his first inhalation of smoke, his eyes opened. What a contrast to later life when he gave up smoking altogether. And then Paul had no interest whatsoever in sport of any kind, which was sad, as I was very keen on all sports. I remember we had an Uncle Reg, who with his wife Auntie Margaret used to come and stay with us from time to time. They lived in Gerrard's Cross, and Reg was a snob, having been to St Paul's School, which he constantly reminded us of. One time he walked up to Paul and said, do you know what tie I'm wearing, Paul? No idea, said Paul. It's the MCC, said Reg with great pride. Paul said, it's no good asking me, I know nothing about football. And then while he was writing, he said, I've just remembered, Paul threw a knife at me once in the lounge and it just missed me. It buried itself in the door to the hall, so you can see we did sometimes clash. I did send back to Tony that Paul was a brilliant shot, so he must have meant to miss, if that was any consolation. Another thing that Tony reminded me of will resonate with Stephen and ring a bell with Duncan. Do you remember how annoyed Paul was when he saw the photograph of all the uncles at Anne's funeral and all the other uncles towered over him? Duncan then sent an altered photograph to him so that Paul was about 6'5" and towered over everybody else. They teased each other constantly over their politics, so it's no surprise that Tony says, we were so different, myself an enthusiastic Tory and Paul an ardent socialist. Our father would not have approved of the latter. I suppose Paul was the first socialist in our family ever, to which I'll add, not the last. Right, I think my lovely friends are about to come and help you get the circulation going. You've all been sat there for far too long, so I'm hoping that they will be able to help you with this.
Right, thank you, Jane.
Paul loved a sad song, but he also liked funny songs. And Jane said, they'll all have been sitting too long, so you'll have to do this one. Please join in the actions, but do be careful of your neighbours. Don't want any accidents. And it's about being old and trying to do exercises, but it doesn't always go quite as you plan.
I would just like to say, on a personal note, having listened to what we have done, it is Paul, how little we knew you. Really. Oh, sorry. Paul. Just sing the song. Okay, I'll wait. Come on, fingers, keep working.
Getting on a bit and I'm not very fit, so I thought I'd do some exercise. Exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day. What an easy way to energize.
Well, I thought it would be fun to go out for a run in me khaki shorts and plimsolls, but I couldn't catch me breath because I didn't have any left, and I waddled like a dog with no insoles.
Yes, he waddled like a dog with no insoles.
Bent double with the speech, I knew there was a hitch, and unfortunately unfortunate affinity for potholes. An unfortunate affinity for potholes.
Devon Lanes.
Well, I'm getting on a bit and I'm not very fit, so I thought I'd do some exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day with a little bit of effort you'll reduce your size.
I was feeling ill at ease, so I thought that Pilates would strengthen my thighs and my knees. I did not anticipate on my leg with all that weight that a part of my anatomy would seize. That a part of her anatomy would seize. With a domino effect, everybody hit the deck. And they stretched us away in 2s and 3s.
Yes, they stretched us away in 2s and 3s. Well, I'm getting on a bit and I'm not very fit, so I thought I'd do some exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day. A lot of heavy breathing. They advise. Well, it wasn't just a whim, so I headed for the gym. I needed a proper structure.
Oh yeah.
But the abs and the dabs and the duction pants very nearly led to a rupture. Yes, they very nearly led to a rupture. And the pecs and the decks put me right off sex.
Oh no.
And there wasn't really anything I took to.
No, there wasn't really anything he took to. Well, I'm getting on a bit and I'm not very fit, so I thought I'd do some exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day. Don't forget a portion of your daily Well, after the gym, I headed for a swim. I thought it would be more relaxing, but 87 length left me feeling tense. Ooh, they say that's how some people do their backs in. Yes, they say that's how some people do their backs in. So I thought I'd have a float, then a comment from a bloke.
Yeah.
Suggested my bikini line is waxing.
He suggested a bikini line is waxing. Well, I'm getting on a bit and I'm not very fit, so I thought I'd do some exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day. One can never tell until one tries. Well, I thought the racket sport might do what they afford to sharpen the fitness and reaction. Chasing bouncy rubber balls and running into walls rapidly diminished the attraction. Yes, it rapidly diminished the attraction. And the passion in the clash when we both went for a smash is the reason that we ended up in traction. Yes, it's the reason that we ended up in traction. Well, I'm getting on a bit and I'm not very big, so I thought I'd do some exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day. Any more than that could be unwise. Very unwise. I was feeling very sore and I wasn't very sure my pursuit for more was meant to be. If to make you feel your best means a cardiac arrest, it's better to avoid fatality. Yes, it's better to avoid fatality. And when I counted up the cost of all the bits I broke or lost, I thought, it's safer done by others, not by me. Yes, it's safer done by others, not by me. I'm still getting on a bit, still not fit. Don't do no more exercise. All the doctors say just half an hour a day. When you've knackered every bit thinks it's no surprise, it's no surprise, it's no surprise, 'cause I had epicondylitis and cervitis all the nighties.
Thrombosis, neurosis, chronic staphylococcus,
Plantar fasciitis, not the lefties but the righties.
Tunicosis, uncoicosis, chronic no,
Yeah,
double
ding,
stumps. Whatever. Carry on.
Osteoarthritis, almost wear me shorts and ties.
Condylomalicitis, you know.
Every osis, R or ISIS, usos, osis, istomyces. Sorry about the spitting. When I counted up the cost of all the bits of broke or lost, I thought, it's safer done by others, not by me. Yes, it's safer done by others, not by me. So if you think you might go there, I've got something I can spare.
What's that?
Me khaki shorts and plimsolls.
Yes.
Me khaki shorts and plimsolls.
Hello, I'm Jake. Gosh, were there really this many of you when I was sitting down? Yes, suddenly the crowd's so much bigger and more. Yes, so probably I knew Paul for probably less time than most of you, if not all of you. I only knew Paul for about 5 years. Relatively late in his life, but he left rather a large impression. I met him because my wife met him at a session, and I'd recently started a business making concertinas, and my wife, being very sort of enthusiastic and helpful, would just give out business cards to anybody in sessions. Oh, my husband does this. And Paul was quite interested and said, oh, well, can I talk to him then? And he did. He called me up and would ask questions, and then and teach me a lot of things. And he invited me to his workshop, and our friendship was basically based around just a love of making things. And I have to say, the things he was doing and getting up to were completely beyond the modern education of kind of engineering and manufacturing as I've known it. Completely beyond it. And mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. And he just would say, oh, well, you know, Jake, you should come along to the Society of Ornamental Turners. Which was an incredible experience, because as I'd started making musical instruments, when you do that, normally you do it alone, and your career becomes quite isolated. You're just working alone. And when he took me to this Society of Ornamental Turners, in one sort of afternoon I got to meet, there's a flute maker, there's a harmonica maker, a bassoon maker, a man who makes and is studying musical saws and making them in all different sizes, from sort of just that big to absolutely massive, and just wanted to talk about them. And I just thought, oh my God, I didn't know there were this many people doing this kind of thing in one place. This is the first time I've ever seen it. It's just incredible. And that really blew my mind. I hope to go again. I'm a paid up member, although I may actually need to renew that. Yes. Now, one of the ways actually Paul left a really big impression on me was, I don't know if I know him much less than probably all of you, because I knew him for such a short amount of time, but it almost appeared to me sometimes like he had no I don't want to say no ego, but the bad things that happened to him, he sort of spoke about them almost like, oh, this mole blew up in my face. and he sort of spoke about it like it was nothing or it didn't matter, or I would just make a light joke about it. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess, Paul, yeah. And, you know, much the same about his illness. You know, oh, I'll see you there, you know, if I'm still alive. Ha ha ha. Okay. And I felt obviously very sad about that, but he was just making jokes about it. Anyway, now, I'm sad to have met him only at the very end of his life and to known him for comparatively short time, but I'm really happy to just be one more person on the long list of us whose lives were just made so much richer for having known Paul. And that's all of us.
And Paul Cameron, he's got to come and say a few words. We will be stopping for some gorgeous food fairly soon, so.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, I'll keep this short. I'll just talk about a few things. So I am also from the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. You've heard from Stephen Locke earlier. So I'm a current curator there. And Paul was RAM's Honorary Consultant on Arms and Armour. He had an official position. And so, you know, this is coming from me, but actually I represent an organisation, so that the museum as a whole pays its tribute to Paul. Paul had a long association with RAM. We've heard about it from Stephen. But he first made himself known to me about 6 years ago. And it came as quite a surprise. I was working, I think, on a project looking at cider and communal drinking. Jim Causley was also part of that. And there was a public event, and suddenly this gentleman was at my side. And he said with a twinkle in his eye, I am your Honorary Curator of Firearms. And I said, no, you're not. I'd never heard of such a thing. I've been at the museum about 10 years and I've never heard of this. Anyway, we had a bit of, oh yes I am, oh no you're not. And eventually Paul convinced me that he was. And in fact I didn't need very much convincing because I was in desperate need of an Honorary Curator of Firearms. I think we heard from someone else that Paul kind of appeared in one's life at just the right time. So I was faced for the first time in my life renewing this enormous firearms license that Stephen talked about. And it was a bit daunting. I am one of the curators that knows nothing about firearms. And so here is this man taking all that pressure off me. That was wonderful. So we quickly undertook for Paul to come and visit our store, renew his acquaintance with the collection of firearms, and tell me some of his knowledge. Paul showed up on a day where I had my three then student volunteers, Tia, Leah, and Laura. Thoroughly charming young ladies, and so there was an extra twinkle in Paul's eye. His enthusiasm was so infectious that what started off as maybe a preliminary visit soon meant that we purloined any tables going. We opened up all the cabinets of historic weapons, laid them all out, and Paul started to tell us about it. And you know, we were all entranced. He was so generous with his knowledge, so enthusiastic, that we all got into it. I think Laura especially. And thinking about it, I am pretty sure that Laura was also lent or possibly given a fiddle, because she was a folkie as well and wanted to practice the violin. So this was suddenly a proper education for me. These things which I'd known existed, I'd known that we had a collection of firearms, I'd opened the cabinets and kind of looked at them. Suddenly they were brought to life. We learned such a lot about the technology, the intricate firing mechanisms, the beautiful decoration, and about some of the people behind these objects. Paul in particular enthused about the products of W.J. Harvey of Exeter, so Exeter's own firearms maker, and just why this firm was so important, how innovative they were, what such high quality weapons they made, and the fact that they had collected the interesting, the intriguing along their way, and then the museum had got this collection. So in particular, there was something called the Capsin Rizzo Patent Repeating Shotgun, which had a series of, and I'm going to get this wrong, so I apologise to the firearms experts. There was a series of flintlocks along the barrel, which, so you fired one, and then you pulled it back, fired another, and then another, and another. I don't think this was a great success, but it was amazing and a beautiful object. And what else? We had the Harvey revolving carbine, and I think Paul said, this is your treasure. This is the best one in the collection. And also the H-Knock sporting shotgun, and I've got a note in the catalogue. It's the height of flintlock perfection. Those are Paul's words. So there then followed weekly visits, and we catalogued and we photographed a large proportion of the collection. And as I said, particularly assisted by student volunteer Laura Jones. So Paul was incredibly generous with his time and knowledge, and incredibly patient with me and my lack of learning, my slow pace of learning. But it was also such a pleasure. We fueled Paul with tea and biscuits, and he also brought along a bar of chocolate. This became a kind of a running joke. He would always in his pocket have a large bar of Cadbury's Dairy Milk chocolate. So my surname is Cadbury, so maybe it was a joke on me. And of course, I said patiently, no food and drink in the stores. No food and drink in the stores, Paul. No food and drink in the stores. And it's like whenever I turned round, there it was with a bar. Put it away, Paul. And it was, that twinkle, that little chuckle, he'd been found out. And the fact that he was managing to dodge our professional conservators as well. Where am I? So yeah, we had a couple of years of extremely productive work. And then, of course, unfortunately, the pandemic intervened and brought a halt to it. Recently, just before he died, he renewed the acquaintance. He kind of gave me a ring, lovely phone call, and started to visit again. And he had a particular thing that he wanted to hand back. He had been working on a lock for a large, essentially a treasure chest. And he'd probably started in the mid-1980s, and he wanted to finish it. And so we did. And so we, one of the, I think possibly even the last time I saw him was him handing back this key that he'd made, and of course it worked beautifully. Paul's connection with RAM went back far longer than me. I mean, you've heard about it all through Stephen, so I won't dwell on that. But the institution gives him a massive debt of thanks. There is a wonderful file that kind of details all Paul's work. There are all these little envelopes with beautifully typed up reports on all the weapons that he worked on, what he did to them, what terrible state they were in before he worked on them, and these are a valuable bit of documentation. There are also so many little notes and letters from various curators and directors imploring Paul to give him his invoice or can we pay you for a bit more? We've just set aside £100 for you, and that seems to be a long time ago. Yeah, I mean, so generous with his time. There is also a letter dated the 26th of May 1982 from the then director David Rogers, and it just said, "I hope you'll be pleased as I am to hear that the Leisure Committee accepted my recommendation that you should be given the title Honorary Consultant on Arms and Armour to Exeter City Museum Service for so long as you wish to retain your links with the museum." And I'm just so glad that Paul took the effort to renew those links with me. It's certainly enriched my life and of other people in the museum. A real privilege to meet someone so special.
I'm honestly just so thrilled to share today with you. And Paul and I, we've definitely had that dynamite trip. It's been wonderful. I wish he was still here. Wish he could be sharing this. But I'm going to stop now because there's lots of lovely food over there. So if people would like to have something to eat or take something with them, if you're going.